Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Dr. Ethan Cole was walking to the break room when his pager rang. Cursing, he checked the message and saw that he was being called into radiology. It was one of those nights, more precisely one of those weeks. He was tired, sleep-deprived, and the only thing that kept his body going was coffee. Coffee because, unfortunately, the hospital didn't have a stash of illegal pills. Ethan was just starting his career, but the hospital and the patients weren't concerned with such minor details. To them, he was the fresh face of a miracle doctor making his rounds. "Yes?" he asked, looking into the radiology department. "We need your opinion on this picture," said the blonde doctor inside. "Do you think it's an infection? The lungs look clean, and there are no tumors or lesions," he concluded after a quick glance. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the obvious cleavage that his colleague was kindly showing him. "Dr. Kowalski, you have..." He hesitantly pointed down. "Dr. Kowalski is my father," she replied. "Call me C." She licked her lips before he could respond. Before he could say anything, C reached out and took his elbow. "Your night shift doesn't have to be as bad as usual. I could do something about this." Ethan gently removed her hand, all the while holding her gaze with his blue eyes. He put his right hand forward, showing off his wedding ring. C looked at him, disappointed. "Come on, how often do you even see her?" "Not as often as I would like," he replied. "I spend most of my time in this place." "When was the last time you went on a date? When was the last time you even had a cup of coffee together?" Honestly, Ethan had to think for a moment, remembering that it had been a few weeks ago. His work had recently consumed him completely. C snuck up on him and offered him a cup of the worst instant coffee in Manhattan, which he gulped down gratefully. "I'm also a doctor," she continued. "I understand these are the hours we have to spend at work. No one else understands why we are away from home so often. Zoe is a nurse. I'm sure she understands. No one will understand this unless they've gone through pre-med, medical school, residency, and masters," he said. "You and I went through fire and water to get here." Before he could say anything else, C spoke again, lowering her voice. "Marriages with doctors don't last long. My father pays child support to 3 different women. The only person who can understand this is another doctor." Ethan stared at her for several long minutes. Her eyes were bloodshot, highlighted by dark circles underneath them. "You need to sleep, C. You need it," he said, hurrying out and disappearing again into the crowd of the hospital. New York Presbyterian was one of the busiest hospitals, even on a slow night. Nurses, orderlies, and doctors ran from one door to another. He checked his watch and realized he would have the next hour free. Heading to the break room, he took out his phone and dialed the first number on his speed dial. Several beeps rang before Zoe answered. "Hello, dear," she said sleepily into the phone. "Hello. How was your day?" he asked. "Tiring as always, but I think yours was even worse. Don't be sad. I have a day off tomorrow when Spencer starts his shift. I can spend the whole day at home. You know I'll have to work late tomorrow," she replied sadly. "You've been late a lot lately," says the one who's halfway through his 24-hour shift, she replied back. "You know that we have a shortage of people. It's the same story everywhere, Zoe." He exhaled, exhausted. "We can handle it. I know we can handle it. We can handle it. I love you, Ethan. I love you too." He hung up and collapsed on the sofa. A couple of doctors nearby were discussing something. He checked his watch again. There were only 10 hours left until Spencer came to relieve him. Ethan prayed to all the gods he knew that Spencer wouldn't be late. Having found a moment of peace, his thoughts began to wander. He took out his phone and scrolled through the photo gallery. There were countless pictures of him and Zoe. Some were from cafes, art galleries, shopping centers, and cinemas. Her wavy brown hair and dazzling smile shone through every photo. She looked beautiful, the same as she came to him every time he closed his eyes. He opened the album with their vacation outside the city. This was more than a year ago, when he still had time to make plans. Each photo was associated with tender memories. 10 years together. Ethan Cole and Zoe Morneau were high school sweethearts. From lab partners in biology class to hosting a school fundraiser, they did it all together. The defining moment came when, at just 18 years old, Ethan proposed to her after graduation, and she said yes. 18-year-olds rarely make wise decisions when they decide to get married. It almost always ends in disaster sooner rather than later. Ethan had a sneaking suspicion that his friends were betting on how many months Zoe could last as Zoe Morneau Cole. But they had grandiose plans, too big for their small town. They moved to New York to start a family. Ethan finished his degree and then worked overtime at a community clinic so Zoe could graduate from medical school for nursing. Zoe tried her best to turn their terrible one-bedroom apartment into something resembling a home. even in the worst times. And there were many, they always knew they had each other. That meant much more than how much money they brought home. The memory of her smile, the sound of her laughter, and the warmth of her touch kept Ethan going. His phone rang, and he saw that it was his friend calling. "Hello, Brian. What do you need?" A woman was admitted to the emergency department after a serious road accident. She has severe internal injuries. Her kidneys are failing, and our nephrologists are on vacation. The replacements aren't board certified. "Then call one of them," Ethan said. "They're both out of state and won't be back until tomorrow. We need to operate tonight, or she'll die of kidney failure. Do you have a free operating room and a surgeon? We need to check, but I think so. Can you do me a favor and take over this case? I'll send her to your hospital by ambulance." "We'll have to talk to the boss," Ethan replied, running his hand through his disheveled hair. "Okay, send her. I'll see what can be done." "Thank you, Ethan, and let Zoe rest. She works so much overtime that I barely see her." There was an awkward silence on the line. "What overtime?" Ethan asked. "Zoe doesn't get paid overtime." "Are you sure?" "Yes, man. I check the overtime logs myself before they go to accounting. I know if she worked overtime." "I'm sure you missed something. Maybe she works unofficially. The nurses union would rip my head off if I tried something like that. And I like my head. Just check again, okay?" "Okay. I'll send you the patient now and assemble a team." Ethan hung up deep in thought. Something didn't make sense, but his tired brain didn't want to dwell on it. He stood up and got busy preparing the operating room and the surgical team. Probably an error in Brian's notes, he thought. The alternative didn't even occur to him. The doctor who replaced Ethan was half an hour late. Ethan cursed him the entire time he rode the subway home. The other passengers looked at him in surprise. His shabby appearance and exhaustion were obvious, but he didn't care. When he reached his door, he could barely stand, almost crawling. He reached the sofa and immediately fell asleep. It was far more comfortable than the one in the hospital break room. Their apartment wasn't bad, modest, but a big improvement from their first home in East Harlem. Honestly, any place was better than that spider den with no running water. Fortunately, the worst was over. They'd live here a little longer, and then they'd finally buy a house. Ethan woke up to two sensations: warmth and humidity. He raised his head and saw his wife. "Did you sleep well?" Zoe asked with a smile. "Yes, but I woke up even better," Ethan replied. "When did you get back?" "Just now. I saw you'd fallen asleep on the sofa and thought, what could be more pleasant than waking up your beloved husband?" "You have a good imagination," Ethan said, affectionately stroking her hair. "Now sit back so I can finish properly." Ethan, of course, didn't refuse such a wonderful awakening. He quickly sat more comfortably on the sofa and leaned back. The exhaustion began to melt away, replaced by waves of pleasure. Zoe leaned back on the carpet, looking at him with a flirtatious smile he loved more than anything in the world. "This is how I like to wake you up," she said. "What about dinner out?" Ethan asked, checking his watch and cursing the late hour. "There's a menu on the kitchen shelf with a number for Sichuan Palace. Just don't order too much. I don't have much of an appetite." "But you haven't eaten all day." "I don't know, I guess I lost my appetite from all that coffee." She gave him a stern look. After a moment, he sighed. "I haven't been taking care of myself lately." "I understand, but we both knew what we were getting into," Zoe said, remaining firm. Ethan leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips, then on the forehead. "Everything will work out. Ryder and Matthews will be back next week, and the workload will be lighter." "Okay," she agreed reluctantly, heading to the kitchen to order Chinese food. "I just hope you don't die from overwork before then." Ethan changed into something more comfortable and started switching TV channels. Finding nothing but tabloid news and reality shows, he turned off the TV and considered taking a shower. "Darling," Zoe called from the kitchen. "I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I spoke with Brian today." Ethan turned, his response dying in his throat. Buy something more comfortable. Zoe had mint sheer panties and a lacy bra that left very little to the imagination. She smiled and seductively licked the tip of her finger. The poor courier from Sichuan Palace rang the doorbell several times before finally giving up and driving back with the uneaten order. "It's just a misunderstanding with Brian's notes." "Of course it is. Nothing else." Ethan reassured himself as he adjusted his tuxedo. The fabric felt suffocating. His bow tie had long since tightened into a noose, and the cufflinks painfully dug into his wrists with every movement. A gray-haired man droned on about the wonderful work of the hospital and its ambitious plans for the future. If death from boredom were possible, Ethan would already be on the verge. He noticed several waiters slipping through a side exit, presumably for a cigarette break. Looking around to ensure no one would stop him, Ethan decided to follow, desperate for an escape. Outside, rain poured relentlessly, turning the empty roads into gleaming rivers. Ethan stood under the awning by the service exit, staring at the smoke clouds swirling around the huddled smokers. "Want one?" a voice asked. Turning, he saw Dr. Kowalski taking a long drag from her Camel cigarette. She offered him the pack. "No, thank you. I just came out to breathe and hide from this unbearable charity event," Ethan replied. She took another drag, the end of her cigarette glowing bright orange in the dim light. The rain intensified, cascading down in sheets. "What do you think?" Ethan asked, pulling a small pendant from his inside pocket and handing it to her. She opened the locket and examined the pictures inside, one of Ethan and the other of Zoe. "Very nice. Where'd you get it?" "Had it made to order. There's a shop on Lexington Avenue that does custom work." "Zoe's lucky," she said quietly, taking another drag. "I wish I could be half as happy." Ethan tucked the pendant back into his tuxedo, avoiding her gaze. For a moment, she studied him, her eyes lingering in a way that made him uncomfortable. It felt as though she was undressing him with her eyes. "You should switch to the nicotine patch," Ethan blurted, desperate to change the subject. "I'd go crazy without these," she replied, flicking her cigarette ash onto the sidewalk. "They'll kill you. We all die eventually, Ethan." Before he could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was Brian. "Hello?" "Ethan." Brian's voice was urgent. "I've checked and double-checked all the overtime logs, work schedules, and log sheets. I'm telling you, Zoe hasn't asked for or received overtime in months. You sure it's not an error on your end?" "It just shows how sloppy you guys at Munir are with accounting," Ethan snapped. "Listen, I called her an hour ago. She told me she picked up an extra shift today. That's impossible. I personally made the schedule for today. Ethan, are you there?" The call ended abruptly. Ethan stared blankly at his phone, a sense of unease creeping in. Across the street, the glow of an expensive restaurant caught his eye, one of those upscale places that far exceeded his and Zoe's combined salaries. The rain blurred his vision, but something drew him closer. Emerging from the awning, he stepped into the downpour, his face soaked within seconds. Everything around him disappeared as his focus zeroed in on the scene inside the restaurant. Behind the glass, Zoe sat at a table with another man, a fair-skinned, impeccably dressed, and groomed stranger. She wore an elegant red designer dress Ethan had never seen before. They were laughing, leaning close, talking animatedly over glasses of wine. Ethan's stomach churned, a sickening wave of nausea washing over him. He prayed he was mistaken, that his rain-soaked eyes were deceiving him. But every step closer confirmed what he refused to believe. Then he saw them kiss. Her lips met the stranger's, closing in a way Ethan knew intimately. The kiss wasn't fleeting. Every detail, the tilt of her head, the way she leaned into the man, seared itself into Ethan's mind, leaving behind a trail of unbearable pain. We all die in the end, he thought bitterly. But part of Ethan Cole had just died ahead of the rest. The rain and the world around him became a blur as he turned and stumbled away. He barely remembered the walk home, now nothing more than a place filled with betrayal. Reaching the sink, he emptied the contents of his stomach, his body heaving violently. Sliding to the floor, Ethan pressed his back against the wall. His wet face mixed with tears as the memory replayed in his mind. Her dress, her laugh, the way she kissed him. Over and over, the images cut him like shards of glass. He rose shakily, wiping his face, and reached for the cabinet. Grabbing a bottle of single malt whiskey, he twisted off the cap and took a long drink. No glass, no water, just the raw burn of alcohol. Hours later, Ethan sat slumped in a chair, the empty bottle beside him. His tuxedo lay crumpled like a makeshift rug, his shirt unbuttoned, and his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. His tousled hair and blank expression made him look like a well-dressed homeless man. "You're not asleep yet?" Zoe's voice broke the silence. She walked in, placing her bag on the counter before sitting beside him. "What happened?" she asked, concerned. Ethan remained silent, his glassy eyes staring into nothingness. "The charity evening couldn't have been that bad," she pressed. Slowly, he turned his head toward her, his unfocused gaze meeting hers. "If you're hungry, I can cook something. Just give me a minute to change into something more comfortable." Her second change of clothes for the day. So many thoughts swirled in Ethan's head. Regret, bitterness, and a deep sense of betrayal. It was all too much for his face to show. Everything seethed inside him. Meanwhile, Zoe returned in her nightgown, unaware of the storm brewing in her husband. "We had another meeting with the representatives of the trade union. More and more of us are being fired," she said casually. Ethan didn't register her words. His life had become a blur, the faces around him unrecognizable. Everything he had once valued reduced to incoherent thoughts. The ground had been pulled out from under his feet. "Ethan?" Zoe's voice brought him back. She looked at him, her face full of concern. "What's wrong with you? You haven't said a word since I came back." He stood up, gripping the back of a chair for support. His limbs shook as he walked toward her. Grabbing her shoulders, he pushed her against the wall. "Ethan," she started, but he cut her off, lifting her nightgown. His mind was too dull to process what was happening. All the humiliation and pain he felt poured into his every move. Zoe arched her neck, trying to kiss him, her lips approaching his. But Ethan recoiled, a vivid image of those same lips touching another man flooding his thoughts. The scene replayed in his mind with agonizing clarity. The tilt of her head, the way her seductive smile merged with someone else's. Now her lips seemed foreign, dirty, not the same ones he had kissed countless times before. He turned his face away, burying it in her shoulder, preferring to stare at the empty wall than meet her eyes. Their marriage flashed before him. Memories of long hours working at the hospital, picking up shifts at a private clinic so Zoe could pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. He remembered how every night, no matter how exhausted he was, her presence made the pain bearable. Now it all felt like a lie, a cruel joke. Zoe leaned against the wall, her eyes closed, a blissful smile on her face. "Damn," she said with a soft laugh. "If you greet me like this every time, I'll have to take on even more overtime." Ethan froze. Overtime. It felt like a mockery. He pulled away and walked out the front door. Outside, he clenched his fist and slammed it into the wall. Pain shot through his arm, and he noticed a trickle of blood dripping from his knuckles. But the Real wound was deeper, bleeding inside him. Sophie Montoya was a third-generation Cuban-American living in New York City. Her family had always been patriotic toward their adopted homeland. Her grandfather had fought in Vietnam, earning a medal for his service, and her father served in the Gulf War before becoming a police officer. Sophie herself had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the NYPD. After a few years, she realized her investigative skills could be more lucrative in the private sector. She became a private investigator, later specializing as an insurance investigator for New York Presbyterian Hospital. Her job was to review claims before they reached insurance companies, ensuring the hospitals didn't deceive insurers the same way they often deceived ordinary people. Sophie had a reputation for being excellent at her job, her skills honed from years in law enforcement and private investigations. Occasionally, she still took private cases. Ethan Cole sat across from her, looking like a man on the brink of collapse. "Wait, you think your wife is cheating on you?" Sophie asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sure of it," Ethan said, rubbing the dark circles under his eyes. "And instead of meeting with a lawyer, you came to me?" Ethan nodded. Sophie studied his exhausted face with curiosity. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "Don't talk. Just listen." She pulled out a small notepad, jotted down a few notes, then looked up. "Let me be clear. If you've already seen her kissing someone else in public, she probably is cheating. Are you sure you want me to confirm what you already know? To show you even more than you've seen?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "What are you, my therapist?" "No," Sophie replied. "I'm just a private detective who's seen this situation 100 times. You're not looking for evidence to confront her. You're looking for a shocking truth that will finally make you take off your rose-colored glasses. You want confrontation, you want answers. But let me tell you, sometimes it's better not to see it. You can still get a divorce and move on without witnessing your marriage unravel in front of your eyes. Isn't it already too late?" Ethan asked quietly. "Not yet, Ethan. So, I'll ask again. Are you sure you want to know? Just confirm whether she's cheating or not," he replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Everything you find will be for me, and me alone." Sophie chuckled softly. "You're a masochist, Ethan. Do you know that?" "Okay, but I warned you." She turned back to the notepad on her desk. "Do you want me to call you if there's an opportunity to catch them red-handed?" "Yes. I think I need to see it for myself." An awkward silence hung in the air. Sophie leaned forward, looking at him with genuine sympathy. "You're not the first person to ask me to confirm their spouse's infidelity. Believe me, it's always better to just leave, rip off the Band-Aid and start over. It'll hurt, but it will pass. Ethan offered a sad smile, but didn't respond. Sophie crossed her arms on the table. All right, let's discuss my hourly rate. Honey, I'm home. Ethan called out as he stepped through the door. Perfect timing. Zoe's cheerful voice greeted him. Come and tell me what you think of this. Ethan walked into the kitchen and saw his wife holding out a spoon with a sample of the dish she was cooking. He tasted it gratefully. Let me guess, he said, trying to place the familiar flavor. Chicken breast cooked with basil and thyme? Zoe laughed, turning back to the stove. Damn, I can't hide anything from you, can I? Just like Mom used to make, but with a bit of pepper, Ethan said, feeling the faint burn in his throat. She'd be proud of you, you know, Zoe said with a smile. You've become a great doctor. Yeah, of course she would, Ethan replied, his tone bittersweet as he hugged Zoe from behind. But enough about her. Let's talk about my beautiful wife. If you keep this up, Zoe teased, you'll end up without dinner. But Ethan was undeterred. His hands slid under her blouse, undoing a couple of buttons. You have 5 minutes to stop, she warned playfully, or there won't be any dinner. To hell with dinner, he whispered in her ear, his voice low and intent. The only dinner I need right now is you, he murmured. He pressed his lips to her neck. Zoe put down the spoon, letting the food simmer on its own. She surrendered to the sensations Ethan's touch sent coursing through her body. The rest of her sound was lost in his kiss. He grabbed her by the waist, turned her to face him, and plunged into a deep, passionate kiss. His tongue sought hers in a slow, intimate dance. Lifting her off the floor, she wrapped her legs around him as he carried her to the nearest surface, the sofa. I love you so much, Zoe, he whispered. Zoe quickly unbuttoned her shirt. Ethan woke suddenly, surrounded by darkness. He glanced at his watch. The glowing digits revealed it was still hours until morning. His mind, fogged by the remnants of a dream, snapped awake as reality crashed over him like a bucket of ice water. How many days had it been since he'd seen them? He tried to count, but couldn't focus. Turning his head, he saw Zoe sleeping peacefully beside him, her lips curled into a soft smile, her arm draped casually over his chest. Did you dream about him too? He wondered bitterly. Ethan climbed out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her. He went to his closet, retrieved a pendant from his jacket, and opened it. The photo inside captured a moment of happiness, a moment that now felt like a lie. Everything is a lie, he thought bitterly. Ethan walked into the lobby of the Peninsula Hotel. His eyes scanned the weekend crowd until he spotted the right person leaning casually against a pillar. He approached Sophie, his exhaustion from sleepless nights weighing heavily on his shoulders. Where are they? He asked, his voice strained. In the penthouse, Sophie replied, handing him a key card. They checked in a few hours ago. The concierge was accommodating for the right price. Ethan pocketed the card. Sophie tilted her head, studying his expression. What are you going to do? I don't know. Ethan sighed bitterly. I really don't know. Wait, Sophie said calmly. She approached him with professional precision, her movements deliberate and composed. He looked at her, puzzled. She shrugged in response. I need to make sure you don't have a weapon. I don't want to become an accomplice to murder. I'll go, Ethan muttered, his voice hollow. Send me the bill tomorrow. They parted ways. Ethan walked as if in a daze, his feet carrying him automatically toward the elevator. A few strangers glanced at him curiously, but he didn't notice. He pressed the button and stepped into the cabin, retreating to the corner. His eyes locked on the digital floor indicator, each descending number a merciless countdown to the inevitable. His heart burned in his chest as if begging for the elevator to ascend infinitely, sparing him from what lay ahead. But the ride was over too soon. The elevator chimed softly, announcing the top floor. With no plan in mind, Ethan stepped forward. His feet carried him down the hallway to the suite's imposing double doors. A do not disturb sign hung mockingly from the handle, as if daring him to reconsider. Ignoring it, he slid the key card into the lock and pushed the door open. The narrow hallway led to a spacious living room. Ethan's gaze landed on a man he instantly recognized from the restaurant. He stood near the refrigerator, a bottle of wine in hand. The man froze mid-motion, staring at Ethan with a mixture of surprise and irritation. Don't people knock around here? The man said in a faint Eastern European accent. Ethan said nothing. The man, dressed in a flannel shirt and boxers, frowned. Change the sheets in the bedroom and bring another bottle of... He stopped, narrowing his eyes as Ethan remained motionless, fists clenched. The sound of blood pounding in Ethan's ears drowned out everything else. Well, the man barked. What are you waiting for? Go do it. A familiar voice called from the bedroom, sharp and unmistakable. Milo, who is it? Those 4 words struck Ethan like a hammer. Her voice. Zoe's voice. The same gentle tone he'd heard countless times during late-night calls from the hospital. Now, that voice was calling to someone else. Probably just housekeeping, Milo said, turning toward the bedroom. Then handle it, Zoe replied. Her figure appeared in the doorway, clad only in an oversized shirt that barely reached her thighs. She froze when she saw Ethan. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror, her face pale and drawn. Ethan stared at her, his wife, in disbelief. Seconds stretched into eternity as he took in the scene. Her disheveled hair, her bare legs, and the casual intimacy of another man in her space. Milo broke the silence first, clearly unaware of the gravity of the situation. "Darling," he said, glancing back at Zoe. "Maybe we should let him change the sheets." He looked stop. Zoe hissed, cutting him off. "Milo, this isn't housekeeping. This is my husband." The word hung in the air like a death knell. "Husband?" Milo repeated, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Hello, Zoe," Ethan said finally, his voice calm but filled with venom. "I see you found a replacement for all those overtime shifts." "Ethan, honey, I'm so sorry you had to find out like this. I swear I didn't mean for—" "Don't," Ethan barked, cutting her off. "Just don't. Ethan, please. It's not what you think." Zoe pleaded, stepping toward him. "I still love you. You have to believe me." "Believe you?" He spat. "You want me to believe you? After what I just saw?" "Ethan, we can talk about this later. Please, when we're home, I'll explain everything. I'll tell you whatever you want to know." But Ethan wasn't listening. In 3 swift strides, he closed the distance between himself and Milo. With a powerful swing, his fist connected with the man's stomach, doubling him over in pain. Zoe screamed, clutching her head in panic. "There's nothing left to talk about," Zoe, Ethan said coldly. "I loved you. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for this." He gestured toward Milo. "It's over." Before Zoe could respond, Ethan turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The elevator, the lobby, the street, all blurred together as he made his way back to their apartment. There, an old friend named Jack Daniels waited to offer him solace he once found in his wife. Zoe returned late that evening, the subway ride giving her too much time to think. She rehearsed explanations over and over in her head, but none of them sounded convincing. Her fear deepened with every step that brought her closer to the apartment she had once called home. Guilt gnawed at her, leaving her hollow inside. Finally, she inserted the key into the lock and opened the door. Ethan sat in the living room, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey in his lap. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. This sight had become all too familiar in recent days, though until now, she had convinced herself it was due to stress at work. Now, the real reason was painfully clear. She entered the living room, feeling only the unbearable weight of the destruction of their marriage. "Ethan," she whispered. Her husband sat in front of her, his eyes empty, his face thin and haggard. He no longer looked like the man she had once known. "How long?" he asked, his voice low, without raising his head. "About 6 months," she answered honestly. Honesty was the least she could offer him now. "Why?" His voice cracked slightly. "Where did we go wrong?" "Ethan, please listen to me," Zoe said as she sat down on the floor next to him, leaning against the wall. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. "I was only 3 years old when my parents moved from New York to Greenville," she began, her voice trembling. "Dad was an investment banker who lost his job. They moved to cut costs. That small town was all I knew." Ethan shook the empty whiskey bottle in his hand, his expression blank, as if hoping for one last drop. Zoe took a deep breath and continued. "My father used to tell me bedtime stories about his life in the city, about the cars he owned, the expensive hotels, the high society. It all sounded like a fairy tale to me, a dream. When you said we were moving to the city, I was thrilled. I thought it was my chance to finally live that fairy tale." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I lived, loved, and fought beside you, hoping that one day we'd have that dream. Ethan, more than anything, I wanted you to be a part of my fairy tale." He said nothing, his face an unreadable mask. "You worked so hard. I understood that, I really did. But it didn't make the loneliness go away. I knew you were doing it for us, but so you decided to cheat on me?" He interrupted, his tone bitter and sharp. "Of course not," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "That thought never even crossed my mind." Ethan's silence prompted her to continue. "One day, Milo came to the hospital as a patient. He needed a minor operation, and I was the nurse assigned to care for him. He was so sweet, so charming. We became close. We talked about everything. Conversations? Ethan scoffed. You broke my heart with conversations? His voice rose, filled with pain and anger. Why didn't you talk to me? Because you weren't there, she blurted out. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile silence between them. Zoe broke down, sobbing openly. I'm so sorry, Ethan, she wept. But you were never there. And he was. I was vulnerable, and he took advantage of that. He had everything my dad talked about in his stories. When I was with him, I felt like a little girl again, living out those fairy tales. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, realizing there was nothing left in the bottle, he let it fall from his hand. It rolled across the carpet with a soft thud. I worked so we could have a home, he said, his voice hoarse. So we could send our kids to college. That's why I wasn't there. I worked night after night, putting in overtime to give you the life you wanted. I know, Zoe whispered, and I love you for it. I swear, I still love you. But she hesitated, her voice barely audible. I'm not in love with you anymore. The words struck Ethan like a dagger, cutting deep into his heart. They echoed in his mind, over and over, each repetition more unbearable than the last. I don't want to fight over anything in the divorce, she continued. I don't want to hurt you any more than I already have. Ethan's body trembled as he covered his face with his hands. His fingers clawed at his hair as he finally broke down, sobbing bitterly. Zoe reached out instinctively, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and pressing her cheek to his. Their tears mingled as they sat there, the raw pain of the moment leaving them both shattered. The bandage is off, Ethan whispered through his tears. And now it's bleeding. 2 days later, Ethan lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The streetlights outside cast long shadows on the walls, flickering in rhythm with the passing cars. His mind still refused to process what had happened. He felt trapped in a waking nightmare. Sometimes he thought maybe this is just a bad dream. Well, if it's a dream, it's not so bad, came a soft voice from beside him. Ethan blinked, startled, then looked down. Sophie Montoya lay beside him, her bare body illuminated by the faint glow from the window. Her curves were accentuated by the dim light, and she smiled mischievously. Ethan grinned faintly as her lips trailed down his torso, leaving a warm, tingling sensation in their wake. Her tongue flicked over his navel as she kissed her way up to his chest, her movements slow and deliberate. You surprised me with your self-control, she whispered teasingly. I thought you were going to explode at her, but you didn't, Sophie said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Ethan sighed, running his fingers gently through her hair. I grew up in a family where my father used force against me, my mother, and my sister. It taught me one thing: never to lay a hand on a woman or child, no matter what happens. Did you ever think this might happen? She asked, sitting up and propping herself on her elbow to meet his eyes. Never, Ethan admitted, shaking his head. I couldn't have imagined it. Reality has a way of throwing surprises at you. That's true, Sophie replied thoughtfully. She paused for a moment, studying his face, her expression soft. He couldn't look away from her, mesmerized by the intimacy of the moment. Her bare form beside him felt surreal, like a scene from a dream that part of his mind refused to accept. Let me tell you a story, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. Several years ago, I had a contract from De Beers. They hired me to track down a man who had stolen a very expensive diamond from one of their mines. They believed he was hiding somewhere in my area. I spent months using every resource and lead I had, but I didn't find a single trace. And then, Ethan asked, lightly running his hand across her collarbone. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from a man in Philadelphia. He told me he wanted to surrender voluntarily for stealing the diamond. He just gave up? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Yes, Sophie said with a small grin. Turned out, he stole the diamond to make an engagement ring for the woman he loved. He carried it halfway across the world, but when he returned, he found she was already engaged to someone else. That's tragic, Ethan said, his voice soft. I didn't have a single piece of evidence against him, Sophie said, her grin fading. But he confessed everything. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. What happened to him? He hanged himself in prison, Sophie said quietly, her tone somber. In a suicide note, he wrote he couldn't bear the pain. She looked at Ethan, concern flickering in her eyes. Should I worry about you? Ethan exhaled slowly. Don't worry. I'm not in jail, he said, attempting a faint smile. But the pendant in his drawer, with 2 faces from his past, told a different story. The divorce was quick and, as divorces go, relatively painless. They had no children. Their finances were separate. Zoe was awarded the apartment until the end of the lease in lieu of alimony. And just like that, it was over. 10 years of joys and sorrows washed away with a court decision and 2 signatures. Throughout the entire process, Zoe couldn't bring herself to meet Ethan's eyes. Ethan moved into a small, one-room apartment near the hospital. It was Spartan, a stark reminder of his first home in the city, but it was enough. One of life's cruel truths is that it always goes on. Ethan buried himself in work. He volunteered for every overtime shift, every extra duty, every late-night gap in the schedule. The hospital became his refuge, a place where exhaustion numbed the ache in his heart. Finally, his boss had to forcibly send him home, insisting he take a break for his own good. Reluctantly, Ethan wandered the city streets. Each corner seemed haunted by memories of Zoe. The park bench where she'd waited for him when he was late. The food truck that made her favorite quesadillas, even at 4 a.m. The jewelry store where he'd surprised her with sapphire earrings for her birthday. St. Catherine Park, where they had once walked hand in hand under the moonlight. His aimless steps brought him to an unfamiliar street. On East 72nd, he noticed an unusual bar with a bright green facade and a neon sign that flickered above the entrance. Jade Bar. Curiosity got the better of him, and Ethan stepped inside. The bar was cozy, with only a handful of patrons scattered throughout. Most were in groups of 3 or 4. A mix of lively students and mature ladies celebrating what looked like a bachelorette party. Ethan took a seat on an overstuffed bar stool and soon caught the attention of the bartender, a friendly Chinese-American woman in her early 20s. "Hi, I'm Jade," she said with a warm smile. "Jade, like at the Jade Bar." "I know, not very original," she added with a light laugh. Ethan glanced around at the tastefully decorated interior. The bar definitely fits the theme, he noted. The walls were covered in vibrant green panels, and small jade figurines adorned the seating areas, giving the space a unique charm. "Thank you, kind sir." Jade bowed playfully. "So, what should I pour you?" "Whiskey. No ice. Make it strong," Ethan said. "Tough down?" Jade asked, pouring the amber liquid into 2 glasses. "Can I ask what happened?" Ethan hesitated, then raised his hand, showing the pale strip of skin where his wedding ring used to be. "Ah," Jade said softly. "Sorry. How long ago?" "A few months," he replied, taking a sip of his drink. "What went wrong?" Ethan sighed. "I don't know. I wish I knew." "Cheer up," Jade said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Being alone isn't all bad. I'm sure the women are already lining up for you." Ethan gave a dry laugh. "I haven't exactly had time to notice." "Well," Jade said with a playful grin, "good news. There are at least 3 people in this bar watching you right now. And they all look interested." "Where?" He muttered, not bothering to turn around. Jade said, pursing her lips as she scanned the room. "Let's see. There's a girl celebrating her last night of freedom before marriage. She's already looked at you twice." "Pass," Ethan replied flatly. "Next?" "Okay. There's a group of older ladies at 10 o'clock. 4 of them are nudging the 5th one to come over to you." Ethan stole a quick glance over his shoulder and groaned. "God, that lady's older than my mother. Imagine what she looks like without makeup in the morning." He took another sip of whiskey. "Who's behind door number 3? Jade craned her neck. "Oh, this is interesting. There's a couple at the far end of the bar. The husband's been whispering to his wife and pointing in your direction for the past few minutes. She looks intrigued too." "What?" Ethan asked, startled. "I'm pretty sure they're about to ask you to sleep with the wife while the husband watches," Jade said confidently. "Do people really do that?" Ethan asked, his eyes widening. "More often than you'd think," Jade said with a smirk. "I've seen it here plenty of times." "Pass," Ethan said firmly, draining his glass in one gulp. "How about another round?" "I don't think so," Jade said, setting the bottle aside. "Are you cutting me off? Am I that drunk?" "Not quite," she replied with a teasing smile. "But if I'm taking you home tonight, I'd rather you weren't half unconscious." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. Jade leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I close in 45 minutes." As the bar emptied, waiters and security helped usher out the last overly intoxicated patrons, even hailing taxis for them. The married couple moved on to another bar, still searching for their ideal gaming partner. Jade finished helping her staff stack chairs and tables, then handed each of them their pay for the night. "Well," she said, turning to Ethan with a mischievous grin. "Where were we?" "All right. This is the part where I take you home and help you forget about your ex-wife. She flagged down one of the last remaining taxis, and they climbed in. In the car, there were clumsy, half-hearted attempts by Ethan to unbutton her shirt, but his drunken fingers betrayed him. Jade laughed and swatted his hands away. Once they arrived, she guided him up the stairs to her apartment. Inside, the details of what followed blurred in Ethan's intoxicated mind. He stumbled and laughed for no reason as Jade dragged him to her bed. She was far more sober and took the lead, effortlessly removing his shirt and trousers. She licked her lips in anticipation. Jade gently traced her fingers down his neck, her lips following, leaving soft kisses on his skin. Ethan sighed softly, immersed in his thoughts, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, as if memories from the past occupied his mind. Jade took her time, her touches soft, her fingers tracing circles on his skin. She paused for a moment, observing Ethan, who, although physically close, seemed mentally miles away. That didn't stop her, though. She kissed him, trying to get his attention. Ethan finally snapped back to reality, watching her movements but still maintaining a distant demeanor. Jade continued to touch his lips and cheeks, trying to bring him back to the present. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, a spark ignited between them. But soon, Ethan was lost in his thoughts again. The room fell into silence, broken only by the gentle sounds of their breathing. Jade tried to create a moment of intimacy, but realized that Ethan remained distant. Still, she stayed close, giving him space to sort out his thoughts while continuing to gently touch his face and hands, trying to create an atmosphere of warmth and understanding. Sweaty and panting, Jade collapsed on her lover. Ethan looked at her and kissed her cheek. Seriously? Is this all I get? Ethan turned on his side and pulled her closer, peppering her with kisses along her cheek and jawline. Finally, he reached her lips and kissed her deeply. That's better, she said, settling comfortably next to him. I immediately realized your thoughts weren't here. Sorry, he apologized. I drank too much, and not much time has passed since the divorce. That too, he admitted. You seem like a nice guy, Jade said, stroking his face. I can't imagine why your wife left you. She noticed the pained expression on his face and knew she had struck a nerve. Divorce guys come to my bar all the time. They're all similar. Either they've already moved on or they're trying to. Did you help them all move on? No, you're special. Honey, Jade said with a smirk. First of all, you didn't try to hit on me the moment you sat down. It's hard to move on, Ethan sighed. It's like admitting that the last 10 years of my life were nothing more than a lie. 10 years in which I loved my wife more than anything. I'm still struggling to accept that it's really over. I can almost hear my father and sister saying we told you so. Jade took his hand and kissed the back of it. Look around, she said gently. People have serious problems. Can you imagine what the world would look like if everyone lived their lives buried in their past mistakes? Moving forward is part of the healing process. You have to accept that. Ethan pondered her words. As a doctor, he understood better than most how bad things could get for people. Jade remained silent for a few seconds before speaking again. You have two options, my friend. You can either move on with your life, or you can wallow in misery forever. I'm sure you understand which of these options sounds better. You're the third person to tell me this. And not in vain, he said with a slight smile. Well, Jade grinned. How about I make us some coffee and we can talk some more? I also know the number for a support group for divorced people. I've given it to many of my clients. Cool. Jade sat up, looking at the still without anything man and licking her lips. Some AID like to take revenge on you. When you're in better shape. Ethan sighed. You're an incorrigible optimist. She confirmed with a mischievous smile, then attached the prosthesis to her right leg, securing it carefully. After ensuring everything was in order, she got up to make coffee. Thank you for your story, the bearded man said. Ethan looked around the small group of people from behind the podium. It was a diverse cross-section of society, different races and genders. Most of the attendees were in their 40s, though some were younger than him. He waved awkwardly to the group before returning to his seat in the last row. Who else wants to share? The bearded man asked. A hand shot up. Everyone watched as a balding, overweight man in sweatpants and a tight t-shirt stood up and began to speak about his misfortunes. He started with how his wife constantly humiliated and offended him, then described tearfully how he found her in their marital bed with her boss. To his dismay, it turned out that the boss was just one of many men his wife had brought into their bed. She gave him a choice. Either accept the current state of affairs where lovers could mock him for his inadequacy or face financial ruin in the event of a divorce. He endured the first option for more than a year, but eventually, she divorced him anyway. Ethan listened, but the story held his attention only for a few minutes. He quickly looked around the group and noticed that many were engrossed in their smartphones or tablets, completely ignoring the man's crying as if it were just background noise, like the sound of a vacuum cleaner. Running a complete waste of time, he muttered, checking his watch. "I agree," said a voice nearby. He turned and saw a red-haired woman, equally indifferent to the monologue unfolding ahead. She was of average height, with a slight build and expressive features. "You're the only one here who said something that didn't make me sick. Glad to hear that," she replied, extending her hand. Linda Harness, she introduced herself. Though perhaps it's time to become Linda DeFazio again. "So, what happened to you?" he asked. "Student romance with a teacher? You know this type?" Ethan stroked his chin thoughtfully. She made herself comfortable on the folding chair and continued, "I should have guessed. After all, he cheated on me while he was married to his third wife. I was fourth on his list, and undoubtedly, while we were married, he was already having an affair with his future fifth wife. It's horrible. It is what it is," she sighed. "He didn't even try to pretend I was the only one for him, but I had to be for him. He's a real tyrant. The next person who marries him can only be a fool. I hope the divorce agreement was good." "Hardly," she laughed. "He's a famous lawyer. Made me sign a rock-solid prenuptial agreement and a confidentiality agreement before the wedding. That should have been my first warning. I'm very sorry that this happened." "Me too," Linda said, tossing her red hair. "When you spoke in front of everyone and said you still loved your ex-wife, I understood you. Despite everything he's done, I still love him just as much as I did 3 years ago. I loved him enough to tolerate his twisted role plays and disgusting fantasies. But he found someone who could love them even more." Ethan looked around and saw that no one sitting near them was paying attention. The meeting had split into several separate groups, and the bearded leader only seemed eager to go home and take a Xanax before bed. "Would you like me to tell you about one of these games? One of his role-playing fantasies?" "You don't need to tell me this," he said softly. "It's hard enough as it is. There's no need to go through everything again. It's fine. In fact, it's for the better," she replied. "My therapist says I need to open up and tell people I can trust about what happened to me. And I feel like I can trust you. You just met me. Let's call it a leap of faith. I believe you won't abuse what I'm about to tell you." He nodded, although he wasn't sure he was ready to hear what came next. He wanted me to dress like a prostitute and stand on a street corner in Harlem. He let me know that he would be watching me from afar. The real easy-to-get girls lined up, some of them studying me curiously. Every car that passed, every lustful old man who proposed to me. I felt dirty and worthless, but I had to play my part by letting them grope me. I had to do everything except go home with him. He was very strict about this. Finally, when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he pulled up in his Rolls Royce. He came out and offered me a wad of bills in front of all the other easily accessible girls. I played my part and got into the car with him, even when the others started whispering. It wasn't until I was in his car that I noticed his friends were sitting in the back seat. "That's enough," Ethan said, raising his hand. "I've heard enough. Please, no more." Linda fell silent. The meeting was finally coming to an end. "My therapist says I have problems with my father," she continued. "He thinks that such meetings will help me deal with my mistakes, but it doesn't work. Something else helps me." "What exactly?" "Come with me. I'll show you." Linda led him out of the building. They took the subway to the outskirts of the Bronx and walked outside. She took his hand and led him past the graffiti-covered walls and the dirty streets until they came to an abandoned warehouse. Dim reflections of light flickered from inside. With growing anxiety, Ethan followed her in and immediately found himself in the thick of the crowd, deafened by the blaring music and flashing lights. The black lights flickered, creating chaos among the glow sticks and bracelets. Silhouettes of people danced around him. "Relax," Linda said playfully, dancing next to him. Ethan felt less and less comfortable by the minute. In the far corner, he could barely make out the outlines of two women kissing. "Come on, dance, Ethan," she said capriciously. "I think it's better for me to leave." "Nonsense," Linda replied. "I'll show you where the real party is." They moved into another room. This one was brighter, and at every step, Ethan could see faces with gothic makeup and outdated hairstyles. All the heavily tattooed and pierced people turned to look at the new arrival. Ethan felt as out of place as possible. "Is this your new friend?" "Linda, this is Ethan." They sat down on what might have once been a bed. Linda kissed him on the lips. Ethan tried to free himself for several seconds and eventually succeeded. Linda looked at him in bewilderment. "What's wrong with you?" "I'm just trying to be kind. I really need to leave." Suddenly, Two more sober members of the group grabbed his arm and pinned him to the bed. Ethan struggled to break free, but was soon grabbed by two more. He looked at them in horror, and his fear intensified when he saw Linda holding a syringe with a maniacal smile on her face. "This is HHH," she whispered in his ear. "Don't resist. Don't resist the necessity. We've all suffered enough. When I heard your story today, I knew I had to help you. Everything will be fine. Say goodbye to your pain," she said joyfully as she stuck the needle in. It was a cold winter morning. The windows were covered with frost, and the last logs of the night were crackling in the fireplace. Daylight shone through the skylight, its warm rays reaching towards the large four-poster bed. Ethan pulled off the thick blanket. The plush mattress literally absorbed him in its warmth. He turned on his side and saw Zoe's head peeking out from under the blanket. She smiled in her sleep, her fair skin and chestnut curls illuminated by the sun's rays. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Zoe fidgeted sweetly, grabbed his hand, and brought it to her lips, kissing each finger in turn. "Good morning, dear." "Good morning," she muttered sleepily. "Let's go see the view." "I like the view here too," she grumbled, turning to kiss Ethan's face and neck. They kissed long and tenderly. Despite her protests, he lifted her from the bed and carried her to the wooden balcony. She rose to her feet and gasped as she saw the snow-capped peaks turn a dazzling yellow in the morning sun. The cold air enveloped them in a damp grip. "I'm delighted." She squealed like an excited child and jumped into his arms. The impact sent Ethan falling onto the hard wooden floor, and Zoe kissed him again. "Happy anniversary, Zoe." The warm rays of the sun gradually dissipated the fog in his mind. The forest house on the snow-covered mountain dissolved, giving way to a damp, destroyed warehouse. Ethan felt his body and realized he wasn't wearing any clothes. He shook his head, trying to shake off the remnants of his trance. There were bodies around him. He felt skin beneath him. He looked down and saw Linda DeFajo lying on the cold floor, her red hair spread out. Her glassy eyes stared at the ceiling, and her hand lay limply on the floor. Instinctively, Ethan checked her neck for a pulse. There was none. Linda DeFajo is finally free of her demons. She would no longer have to submit to the perverse whims of any man. As she was now, Ethan felt nauseous. His stomach felt like it was filled with lead, and the room began to spin and tilt in front of him. He struggled to his feet and leaned against the wall, his headache feeling as if it had been hit with a hammer. Taking a few deep breaths, he tried to come to his senses and looked around. There were other bodies around him. Some of them barely moved, others lay motionless. Ethan checked the pulses of several people, finding them alive. He saw a pile of abandoned clothes against the wall and began to rummage through them. Some of the bodies had serious wounds from needles and sharp objects that had torn the skin, and he provided first aid using improvised tourniquets. Finally, he found his clothes and mobile phone. It was late afternoon when he finished giving his statement to detectives and was examined by medical staff. According to him, it was a new street mixture of banned substances with lethal side effects. He was lucky to survive. Ethan walked out of the building, staggering. The sun was too bright, and he covered his eyes with his hand. He sat down on a bench near the embankment, covered his face with his hands, and began to cry. Nothing else mattered to Ethan. He had hit rock bottom. Tears ran down his hands and dripped onto his forearms. Passersby glanced at him, but he did not stop crying. These were tears that had been accumulating for a long, long time. Tears that were poisonous. Finally, he allowed the poison to come out. He took out his phone and made a call. Several rings passed before a surprised voice answered on the other end of the line. "Though you were right," he murmured, finally accepting the need to move on. The next few weeks became a time of sobriety and awareness for Ethan. He made a conscious decision to end his post-divorce streak of casual affairs and self-destruction. He had reached the lowest point of his life. The only way was up, and he was going to follow it. "Another case has arrived," said one of the senior doctors, handing Ethan a folder. Ethan groaned. "Another child swallowed a coin? This is the third one today." If parents were more careful about what their children put in their mouths, the emergency room wouldn't be so crowded. He gave a few brief instructions to the nurse and sent the child with her. Ethan loved his job, except for the weekly emergency room duties, of course. Sometimes there were real accidents where he could make a difference, but most often it was treating minor wounds and tending to sprains. Grumbling, he moved to the next patient behind the curtain. He pushed it aside and saw an equally bored patient. "So, what's wrong with you?" he asked. "Nothing," the girl replied sarcastically. her dirty blonde hair hiding one side of her face. Nothing. Do you need me to repeat it twice for you to understand? I thought doctors were smart. Who brought her in? Ethan asked as he stepped out from behind the curtain. A young paramedic quickly ran up with a folder. She tried to jump from the roof of an apartment complex. One of the residents managed to grab her in time. Nothing serious, just a couple of cuts and bruises. But we need to keep her for a psychiatric evaluation. I didn't try to jump from the roof. Idiot, came the voice from behind the curtain. I'll deal with her, Ethan said. He took the folder and returned to the room. So, Miss Pendergast, he read from the first page, do you like standing on the edge of the roof for the sake of the view? Yes, she shouted irritably. I was looking for a good angle to take a bird's eye view when the stupid well-wisher pulled me back for a photo. Wait, she said, pulling out a large bag from under the bed. She unfastened it and took out a cool camera and a set of lenses. Are you satisfied now? Are you a photographer? On better days, yes. You know what? Go to the waiting room and bring me the latest magazine you have. Out of curiosity, Ethan went and fetched the latest issue of Time magazine from the shelf in the waiting room. His patient flipped through several pages before reaching a double-page spread that showed a photograph of the aftermath of the shelling in Gaza. She smiled and pointed to the tiny signature in the corner. Samantha Pendergast, she said, yourself. If you want to get to know me better, are you filming for Time? I'm actually a freelancer, but I've submitted materials to Time, National Geographic, and even some decent newspapers. They call me when they need something memorable. Ethan sat down next to her and lingered for a moment. In the photo, it was almost artistic, the way the smoke rose from the ruins. Admit it, you thought I was just another crazy woman with a camera, right? Maybe a little. Ethan smiled sheepishly as he briefly scanned her file. Okay, he said, standing up and straightening his robe. I think you're free. I don't see any problems with you. It's a pity I can't say the same, Sam answered. I'm sorry, Ethan replied. You know, photographers, at least good ones, are very observant. Most of my photography takes days, even weeks, of waiting until I capture the perfect moment. I can tell everything about a person by looking at them. The more you try to hide your weaknesses, the more you become an open book. Ethan paused for a moment, and she grinned mockingly. You have a strip of light skin on your finger from a wedding ring. Your clothes are not old, but they are 2 sizes too big. You've lost a lot of weight recently. The most noticeable thing is your eyes. From the moment you pulled back the curtain until now, the only time there was a spark was during our conversation. You haven't been sleeping well for a long time, have you? Were you my psychologist? No, she smiled. Your friend, if you please. Look, I'm sorry you were dragged here for no reason, but I think... Ethan was abruptly interrupted by Sam's camera. She proudly looked at the photo she had taken on the digital screen. Look, she suggested, turning it towards him. Ethan just waved it off. This is my blank canvas now, she said. I'm gonna make you look a lot better, and then we'll take another photo, something like a before and after. I'm flattered by your enthusiasm, but I'm not in a state for other relationships. He finished for her. Me too, she replied. Nobody said we couldn't be friends. He gave in, which delighted her. Great. I have an extra ticket to the launch of Neil deGrasse Tyson's new book at the Strand this Saturday. More precisely, no, but he'll get it, Ethan replied, looking at her in complete bewilderment while she calmly made plans for the weekend. Sam saw his confusion and burst out laughing. If you think I'm special, wait until you get to know me better. How do you like it now? I'm even more confused about black holes than I was after watching Interstellar, Ethan said, as he and Sam walked along Fifth Avenue. Ethan put his hands in his pockets to protect them from the cold air. Sam was wearing a scarf wrapped around her neck and a sweatshirt from the RH Island School of Design. But you must admit, it's exciting, the thought of what could be out there, so far away that no one will ever see. Ethan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and rejected the call. Sam noticed but decided not to interfere. I looked up information about you, he said. You didn't mention the Pulitzer Prize. I'm flattered, she smiled. They reached Washington Square Park. The sidewalks were dotted with street performers, from spontaneous artists to jugglers and musicians. Sam laughed and handed out tips to everyone she passed. Ethan stopped to admire a pair of mimes skillfully enacting a scene. Don't let the situation fool you, he said. There are some truly talented people here. A painting for a couple? Suggested the cheerful young artist. Actually, we're just... Ethan started, but Sam interrupted, giving him a stern look. She dragged Ethan toward the artist while the painter set up her easel and palette. A little to the right. Now, hug her. That's better, exclaimed the energetic girl with a ponytail and got to work. While we wait, why don't you tell me about yourself? Sam suggested. Shouldn't a real photographer be able to guess for himself? He joked. Her dissatisfied look immediately stopped him. Ethan paused and finally began to speak. Born and raised in Greenville, a town in the northern part of the state. Immediately after school, I moved here with Zoe. I went to pre-med at New York University on a scholarship, and now, 10 years later, here I am. This is the shortest and most boring biography I've ever heard, she teased. What about you? My father is Irish. My mother's family includes Germans, French, and Spaniards. Essentially, I'm half of Europe rolled into one. Born and raised here in New York, and now home is wherever my camera takes me. They paused their conversation for a moment to strike a pose suitable for the artist. The chirping of cicadas was heard in the air, and the birds returned to their nests. The road was filled with the usual noise of traffic. Everything's ready, the artist announced. The couple came to look at their image on the canvas. The painting was incredibly detailed, highlighting every curve of skin and contour of muscle against the evening light. Sam's portrait showed a big smile on her face, while Ethan seemed rather awkward. Sam paid the artist generously for an honest image. A few days later, Sam insisted that Ethan go with her to the Gauguin Gallery, where her friend's work was exhibited. He arrived at her loft in Soho, not quite knowing what awaited him. Ethan rang the doorbell and waited. A few seconds later, an unshaven man in a fedora opened the door. "Sam is waiting for you, by the way. My name is Damien." Ethan shook hands with his new acquaintance. Damien preferred bright colors and wore red, green, and blue at the same time, in the most saturated shades. Just looking at him for a long time could cause a headache. Ethan followed him through a hallway, the walls decorated with an eclectic selection of paintings and photographs. In several of them, Sam was the central figure in a group of people. "She talks a lot about you," Damien continued. The last door on the right led to Sam's studio. Damien opened the door and motioned for Ethan to come inside. For the first time, Ethan saw Sam at work. Her light brown hair was neatly combed and parted on the sides of her face. She was wearing a tight t-shirt and jeans. The camera strap hung around her neck as she focused intently on the settings on the back panel. "Sam, you have a visitor." She looked up from the camera and smiled widely. "I see you've already met Damien. He's also a photographer, by the way. He mainly shoots fashion. This is exactly what I had in mind when I spoke about the fruit with the camera earlier." She laughed. "This never gets old." Damien grimaced, throwing his hat on the bed. Ethan looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The studio was full of bright images and colors. Overcoming his disorientation, he asked, "So, you and him are dating?" "God forbid," Damien laughed. "She's not my type. A pleasant face is not to your taste?" Ethan joked in response. "Nice face, yes," Damien said bluntly, "but not hers. But ID put you to bed without question." Damien turned to Sam with a satisfied smile stretching from ear to ear. "Give me one night, and I'll turn you over." Sam burst out laughing again, as did Damien. They laughed, supporting each other, until Ethan turned red to the tips of his ears. "Damien is between relationships now, so he lives with me," Sam explained. "He's my best friend and a walking stereotype of a fashion photographer." "Sorry for the unexpected turn," Damien said, straightening up. "I hope my gayness doesn't bother you." "Not at all," Ethan answered quickly. "My sister is also gay. They'll have to get to know her sometime." Sam smiled faintly, unsure if she shared that desire. "So, you're sure you don't like men?" Damien asked, looking a little sad. Ethan shook his head. "Even a little." "Wow, I haven't seen you this upset since we watched Red Wedding." Sam grinned, zipping her camera into her bag. "Let's go, Ethan. It's time for us." "It was nice meeting you, Damien." "Mutually. Let me know when you're ready for a change of scenery." "And by change of scenery, do you mean a night of good, heart intimate?" Damien said with frightening calm. Ethan practically ran the last few steps to get out of Sam's loft. "Don't let Damien get to you. He's actually a very nice guy." The Gauguin Gallery was full of top-notch artists, even top-notch critics, and random guests. No matter how hard Ethan tried, he couldn't see anything special about the onyx sculptures of huge faces, but they received rave reviews from everyone present. "Ethan, meet Alexei, the man behind the art," Sam exclaimed, dragging an anorexic man with a cane behind her. As always, Sam had an overwhelming sense of enthusiasm. "So, you're that saying," Ethan remarked, shaking his hand. "Blink twice if you're here against your will." They laughed and exchanged pleasantries. Alexei gave them a brief explanation of his work and then went in search of his agent. "Let me know when you start dying of boredom," Sam whispered in Ethan's ear. About an hour later, They were already on the subway. Ethan's phone rang again, and he thought for a moment before rejecting the call. Sam noticed this, and her mood became depressed for a moment. Ethan patted her on the shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Nothing like that. Just pseudo-philosophical nonsense. Try me, I'm a good listener. You mentioned my Pulitzer prize. Have you seen the photo for which I received it? Photos of boys from Africa." "Yes, I remember. They had just been released from the diamond mine." "Not released," she added sadly. "They were taken out of the mine only because they were old enough to understand the value of diamonds. They could be used for smuggling, so they were sent to the army to die there. It's horrible, but not for me," she said bitterly. "My photograph of them being led out of the mine won me a Pulitzer, as they marched toward their almost certain death as child soldiers. My reward is drenched in the blood of their childhood." There was silence between them for a few minutes before Sam sighed heavily. "I often wonder, can the world be one big zero-sum game, where someone's happiness always comes at the expense of another? Is it possible for two people to create happiness out of nothing?" Ethan scratched his chin thoughtfully. Just a few months ago, he would have been sure of the answer, or at least thought he knew it. "I'm probably not the right person to ask such questions," he admitted. "At the moment, I have a very biased attitude towards relationships." "You're not the only one," she said so quietly that only Ethan heard her. She looked down and began fiddling with her camera strap again. "So, are we still going to Lord's concert next week?" Sam had promised Ethan that she would become his friend. Her definition of friendship included going to see independent films, exploring new restaurants, and having fun attending avant-garde theater productions. She was an incorrigible optimist, always trying to bring a smile to his face. Over the next few months, Ethan learned to smile again. His colleagues noticed that he no longer looked like an emaciated man who had survived famine. He returned to a normal work schedule, as normal as possible with his fast-paced career. He became her constant companion at various parties, from rooftops on the Upper East Side to huge yachts on the Hudson. Ethan immersed himself in the crazy and eccentric world of art and journalism, with Sam as his guide. Finally, the day Ethan had been dreading arrived. Sam invited him to a more private event. They dined at a Japanese fusion restaurant, and at her request, a significant amount of sake ended up on Ethan's pants. "Do you want me to meet your family?" "God, you're talking about this like a colonoscopy," she laughed. "I don't want anything from you. It's just that my parents are curious about who this guy is who's taking up all my time lately. It's my father's birthday, and how many people will there be?" He blurted out, wiping a wet spot on his trousers with a nearby napkin. "Only my parents and my brother's family. My brother is currently serving in Iraq, but his wife and daughter will be there. These are the nicest people you'll meet. They'll have to take your word for it," he muttered, desperately trying to save his trousers. He lowered his voice and asked, "Don't you think this will give the wrong impression? No one will think that we're dating. How can you be so sure?" Sam put down her fork and took a deep breath. For a moment, Ethan saw the same depressed expression he had seen on the subway. Internally, he cursed himself for his lack of timing. "Sorry," he quickly added. "You don't need to explain anything. Thank you. I just have good reasons not to return to such relationships again." Before Ethan could apologize again, Sam gave him a familiar smile and asked the waiter to bring a new bottle of sake. "Stop acting like a girl. You look great." Ethan sat in a rental car a block from Samantha's brother's house, making sure his tuxedo fit just right. It was a pleasant house in Westchester on a quiet suburban street. Samantha finally convinced him that he looked decent. They walked to the door and rang the bell. Two sets of footsteps were heard, fast and light, and the step of an adult. The door swung open, and standing in the threshold was a little girl who seemed to be no more than 3 years old. "Unsum!" She screamed and jumped into Samantha's arms. Samantha picked up her niece and began kissing her all over her face. "Lana, it's been so long. You've become an even more charming princess than I remember." She put the girl on the floor, but continued to hug her tightly. A pleasant-looking brunette appeared. "Lana, give your aunt a rest, okay?" she said. "Everything's fine," Samantha affirmed, still holding her niece in her arms. "And you must be Ethan," the woman said, holding out her hand. "Imtaya. I'm sure I've already told you everything." "Nice to meet you," he said, handing over a bottle of Chave Hermitage Block. "Come on in, meet the others." Ethan followed her. The house was small but carefully maintained. The walls led to the kitchen and dining room and were decorated with many photographs. He stopped in front of the central wall and noticed a photograph in an elaborate frame. It was a photo of Samantha, her niece, sister-in-law, and presumably her parents and brother. Her brother was dressed in military uniform with many awards and medals on his chest. "Don't let his photo fool you," Samantha said. "There's a funny guy behind all that military decor." Ethan turned around to see Samantha holding out her hand to him. He took her hand, and she led him to the dining table, where there was a huge Belgian chocolate cake with countless candles. He greeted Samantha's parents. Despite their age, they looked surprisingly cheerful. "Quick, let me blow out the candles before Ethan can count them." There was laughter as Samantha's father blew out all the candles in 3 attempts. He cut the cake into 4 pieces and fed it to the 3 women who were waiting in line. Lana took the last piece and smeared it all over her face. "Lana," sighed her disapproving mother. Before anyone could stop her, she took her daughter to the bathroom. "So Samantha told us that you are a doctor," Samantha's father remarked. "Yes, sir," he confirmed. "I specialize in traumatology." "Stop calling me sir," he laughed. "It's my birthday, don't make me feel older." Thea returned with a tray full of light snacks. Samantha took the initiative and opened a bottle of wine, pouring it into 5 glasses. "Do you work in the city?" Samantha's mother asked. "At New York Presbyterian. The other day, I received an offer from Mount Sinai. There, I will have more opportunities." "That's worth a drink," Thea said and raised a toast. "Do you have your own housing in the city?" "They say finding an apartment is hell. For now, only a small apartment near work. If I plan to invite you to visit, you'll have to find something better." "That would be fun." Cookies and baked goods disappeared within minutes. Talia carefully went to replenish the tray and sat down on the couch next to Ethan. "James told me that this is his last tour. He has already found a job with a private security firm run by his former army friends." Everyone took another bite of food as little Lana climbed onto Samantha's lap. "When will Dad return?" "I'll be back very soon, Lana, and this time for good." Lana clapped her hands and screamed with joy. Samantha lowered her head and kissed her all over her face again. "Samantha is very close to her brother," Samantha's mother told Ethan. "They were inseparable since childhood. There was not a single secret that one of them didn't know about the other." "Why don't we show him the recording?" suggested the father. Philia nodded and took out the disc. "This is a recording from 4 years ago." The TV screen came to life. The first scene showed Samantha's parents whispering to each other. The camera moved to the courtyard, where a large party was taking place. Philia, visibly pregnant, poured drinks and chatted with her friends. The camera panned to Samantha, who was trying to focus on a squirrel sitting nearby. Then the camera cut back to Samantha's parents, who were gesturing toward her, and then back to Samantha with her camera. Suddenly, a large man appeared in the frame and lifted her into the air, spinning her in his arms. Samantha screamed with joy before returning the hug. The guests at the party gasped, and Thea rushed to hug them. There was applause. Captain James Pendergast had returned early from his tour. The camera captured his face sandwiched between the identical smile